Welcome to Make It Matter. Today we're making floating nightstands. I made these floating nightstands out of wood and bent brass sheet as a commission. The warm color of the brass shelf complements the oak and white drawer perfectly. To make two nightstands, I used an 8-inch wide and 6-inch wide oak boards, a 12 by 36 inch sheet of brass that was 0.05 inches thick, two 12 by 24 inch half-inch thick sheets of plywood, a jigsaw, or really anything you have to cut a straight line in sheet metal, my Japanese handsaw, but again, any type of saw you might have here will work as well, my cordless drill, a Kreg pocket hole jig along with some Kreg pocket hole plugs, and an orbital sander to smooth everything out. I started off this project with the brass shelf. I don't have a lot of experience working with metal, so I wanted to get this out of the way early. Plus, I could then reference my measurements for the oak pieces from the brass shelf itself, since that is the harder part for me to change later. I first needed to cut the brass sheet in half to make two 12 by 18 inch sheets, one for each nightstand. I measured the brass and marked right on the protective plastic layer with a Sharpie. I then ended up cutting the sheet with a handsaw, as I did not end up having any metal cutting blades for my jigsaw on hand. Here, it's just important to get as straight a cut as possible. Once I had my two sheets of brass, it was time to bend them into an L shape to form the back and bottom shelf of the nightstands. The most important thing here is to make sure that the bend is straight, and if you're bending more than one piece, try to make them as repeatable as possible. I measured out 10 inches from one end. This will be the back of my nightstands, leaving 8 inches for the depth of the shelf. Next, it's time to bend the brass to 90 degrees. Here I'm going to use the edge of my table to bend against. I lined up the line I marked on the brass to the edge of the table and used my plywood and some clamps to sandwich the piece in place. I then placed some heavy weight on top to counter the force from bending the brass. Next, I clamped the 2x4 scrap to the end of the brass to help distribute the force evenly across the brass sheet, and then just started bending. This brass sheet is pretty thin, and therefore is pretty easy to bend. But if you have a thicker material, you can use a similar method and just may need to add some longer scraps for leverage. I learned a lot about this bending method from a video over on the Homemade Modern channel, so I'll link to that video in the description for you to check out. After the brass pieces were bent, I peeled off the edges of the plastic film and used my orbital sander with an aggressive grit sandpaper to round over the corners and smooth out the edges. Specifically, that edge that I cut earlier. At this point, I moved on to making the wooden shelf and drawer. These drawer boxes were referenced directly off of the brass sheet to ensure the best fit when both pieces were assembled together later. I started with the oak 1x8 to make the top of the nightstands. I measured about 12 inches and cut the top pieces. I then subtracted 2 times the thickness of my oak boards and cut the bottom pieces to this length to account for the two sides. Then, due to my design having a slight overhang on top, I ripped down the bottom pieces about the thickness of one board. I then moved on to the 1x6s and cut the two sides in the drawer front for both drawers. Then, it was time to drill some pocket holes using my Kreg pocket hole jig. This is a fast, simple, and strong way of joinery for this type of project, but if you're not a pocket hole fan, you can always use more traditional means of joinery here. The design for these nightstands allowed the pocket holes to be plugged and only really visible from inside where the drawer would cover them up, or from the bottom. I then attached the two sides to the top first, since I wouldn't be able to get in to drive in the screws later had I done the bottom first. After driving in the pocket screws on the bottom, I went back through and plugged all the holes. Once those were dry, I could take my flush trim saw and get rid of the excess. Before moving on to making the drawers, I sanded everything making my way up through the grits to get them nice and smooth. I then took some sandpaper on a sanding block and went over all of the edges and corners to take away any of the sharp edges. The drawers are made out of 1/2-inch plywood, and I referenced all of my measurements off of the drawer boxes that I created previously to make sure that the drawers had a nice fit within the boxes. I'm cutting the pieces to essentially create another box that fits snugly into the drawer box, so it doesn't rattle around, but has enough room to slide out with ease. So it's very important here to reference these pieces off of your drawer box. Once I had all the drawer pieces cut, I could go ahead and again drill pocket holes to connect all of the pieces together. After a lot of pocket holes were drilled, I could go ahead and assemble the drawers. I used my clamp setup to get the pieces all aligned and drilled in all the pocket screws. I started by attaching the back of the drawer to the sides and then placed in the bottom pieces. For the drawers, I didn't go back and plug all the pocket holes since they wouldn't be seen anyway. The next step was to attach the drawer fronts. This was tricky as I needed to get all the fronts lined up so that they sat in the drawer boxes perfectly when closed. I didn't get it on camera unfortunately, but I ended up using some double-sided tape to attach the drawer fronts while they were inside the drawer boxes, and then took the drawers out and attached them permanently with the pocket holes. I then found the center of my drawer front and drilled a pilot hole for the brass drawer pulls that would eventually be attached by the client. Now that the drawers are together, here you can see how they look assembled. I can now work on marrying the brass shelf with the drawer boxes. I placed the brass shelf directly on the back of the drawer boxes to get them lined up and went about marking where I would later drill holes for the attachment screws. At this step, I also used the French cleat hardware that I purchased for this project to mark out where those holes would need to be. I then took a marking punch to all of the spots that I wanted to drill to get a center reference and to keep the drill from walking on the brass when I went to drill the holes. Next, it was time to drill. I removed the brass and drilled the holes all the way around, starting with a smaller drill bit and working my way up to the size I needed for my screws. Once all the holes were drilled to the correct diameter, I put the brass back on the drawer boxes and temporarily attached them with some tape so that they wouldn't move while I was marking and drilling pilot holes. I then went around and punched and drilled out all of the holes in the drawer boxes as well. I probably didn't need to drill so many holes, but I was using small brass screws for the connection and I wanted to make sure it could support the weight of the drawer boxes. Now on to finishing the brass. I laid out the brass shelves and wiped them down with mineral spirits to make sure that they were clean and could accept the polish that I could then apply. Polish can just be wiped onto the brass and then wiped off with a damp rag. This really cleaned the shelves right up to a nice shine. The client wanted to finish the wood pieces of the nightstands themselves to match some of the other furniture they had in their room. So I don't have the video of the final finishing and assembly, unfortunately. But I think they turned out really great the way that they finished them with the oak, brass, and white aesthetic. I learned a lot about making drawers and working with metal on this project. Because brass is so soft, it's pretty easy to work with for a first timer, and it looks really great paired with the wood. The only knock on it would probably be the price, as the brass sheet was by far the most expensive aspect of this project. While building these nightstands, I was also making my way through the first book of the Kingkiller Chronicle series by Patrick Rothfuss, and had that book sitting on my own nightstand. I would highly recommend the book, and really wanted to call out worldbuilders.org, which is a non-profit organization that was started by the author, Patrick Rothfuss, which supports humanitarian efforts worldwide. I made a donation to the World Builders and encourage everyone to head on over to worldbuilders.org to make your own contribution. They even have a shop where you can purchase merchandise from works by Patrick Rothfuss and plenty of other artists and authors, with all proceeds going directly to the cause. Thanks to everyone who watched, and especially to those who went on over to worldbuilders.org to make a donation. I plan on showcasing a different cause with each video I post, so if you want to learn more about other great organizations doing good in the world, please go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.